Well, good morning, everyone. This is Warren King. I'm the co-manager of the Pasture project, and I'd like to welcome you to our first webinar in the series for Upper Midwest Grazing Educators. Really want to thank our collaborators and partners on this, Greenland's Blue Waters, our first webinar teaching the basics of grazing, and we're going to jump right into that. First, I'd like to introduce Jane Jewett. Jane is representing the Greenland's Blue Waters Group, the Midwest Pasture, Perennial Pasture and Forage Committee is where Jane does a lot of work, and she's also the coordinator of the group. You can see she's a research fellow at the University of Minnesota. As I mentioned, I am the co-manager of the Pasture project. Have my own business that's focused on environmentally sustainable farming and developing local and regional food systems. So following this introduction, the first order of business is to turn it over to Jeff Farbman from the Wallace Center. Jeff is going to explain to you all how to kind of move through the presentation or the webinar technically, how to participate, because we really want this to be as interactive as possible for you to be able to ask questions. And Jeff, why don't you take it from here?
Thanks, Warren. Happy to do so. So the software is pretty straightforward. You see the presentation there on the left, and on the right, you should have your control panel. Sometimes the software collapses the control panel. It should be way over there on the right side of your screen. So if you just click that orange arrow button, it will expand, and you can keep it that way. If you go to the View menu and deselect Auto Hide the Control Panel, your control panel will stay that way. The reason you might want to do that is because there are two ways. Today there are going to be two ways to interact with us. You can either type your question in the control panel, or you can raise your hand. Hanging off the left-hand side of the control panel, there is a button right there. You can raise your hand. If you raise your hand, if you have a question, raise your hand, and we will unmute you. For those of you who are not sure, you're sort of listening to me through your computer audio, you're not sure you have a built-in microphone, you may not want to use the raise your hand system. Just type in the question. But if you are calling dialed in on the phone, or you know that you have a microphone or you're using a headset, go ahead and raise your hand, and we will are able to have a more interactive session that way. The last thing I wanted to mention is that we do have a post-webinar survey. It will pop up right when the webinar ends. Go ahead and fill it out there. If you have to quickly run to a meeting, though, we will email you a link to it. Please fill that out. It really helps us make this a better experience and work on continuous improvement. Okay, that is it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm not sure if it looks like I may have control of the slide deck here. So some pretty pictures of cattle grazing here, thanks to Dr. Alan Williams. Robert, do I have control of the slides, or does our next presenter? Great, I have control. Thank you. So who's sponsoring the webinar? As I mentioned earlier, Greenland's Blue Waters, along with the Pasture project. And what are some of the goals of the webinar series? Certainly, and in our two projects, excuse me, so increasing perennial forage, as you can see, environmental performance in farming, and maintaining production profitability. The Pasture project is very focused on improving water quality and accelerating transition in sustainable farming production, especially around grass-based agriculture in the upper Midwest. So we have a lot in common, as I'm sure we have a lot in common with folks on this call who are grazing educators. So these goals of our groups are not foreign to you, and I'm guessing that you're probably familiar with us or even a part of some of the things that we're doing. So why are we focusing on grazing educators? You can see the list here. I think for myself, principally, we've got more landowners and conservationists that are really interested in the benefits of livestock, for the conservation benefits, for the soil health benefits, for the wildlife and habitat benefits, and there's a lot of a growing body of evidence that putting grazing back onto the land is, really beneficial, not only to the land but the environment overall. As far as the Pasture project is concerned, we've been kind of utilizing this growing demand in pasture-raised meats, specifically in grass-fed beef, as a way to work with producers and landowners as we can work to try and accelerate this. As we all know, there's less public funding as well for grazing networks and education. A lot of that funding has been cut. So we kind of believe that there may be a need here or an opportunity to start to build a network of grazing educators. So what could a network achieve? A lot of different things that we've listed here is what could be achieved with a network in the upper Midwest of grazing educators. I think right now one of the most important things, and really the reason that we're doing this webinar series to kind of find out what interest there is building this collaboration from the bottom up, from a grassroots as opposed to as top down. But as you can see here in these various bullet points, that there is a lot of things that potentially could be achieved through a grazing network, and probably not the least of which is to start to establish what are the basic principles around managed grazing that everyone wants to teach. So here's the format for today. Our presenters will discuss the topics. They're going to share their insight, experience. I know them all very well, and I think you will enjoy listening to them and hearing what they have to say. We encourage you as the audience to do the same, and Jeff has technically explained to you how to do that, either through the chat box or by raising your hand. Because of the number of people in attendance today, we may not get to every question, and we may, if you've got multiple questions or comments, we may limit that to give everyone a chance. We've got several moderators, both myself and Jane, plus a couple of folks who are on our team who are behind the scene. Both Robert and Matt will be helping out to kind of direct traffic and keep things moving forward. And as Jeff said, there is a brief survey at the end of the webinar. We'd really appreciate if you would take that survey. It's going to help us directionally. We do have a half a dozen topics over the next 6 months that we've already lined up and teed up, and we want to continue to do this. And if there are other things of interest, if we can develop collaborations electronically, sharing electronically that are outside of these webinars, we'd sure like to understand that. Oh, and as a reminder, if we don't get to all your questions, there is room in the survey to add in anything that you think about later or that we didn't get answered, and we will make absolutely sure to follow up on that. Okay, so let's jump right into this. So I want to introduce Rhonda Gildersleeve. Rhonda is a UW Extension specialist who's worked extensively in grazing systems around ruminant animals, beef, sheep, and dairy, native of Grant County, Wisconsin, and you can see her credentials there. In her spare time, Rhonda manages her own organic dairy in Wisconsin, and I know she was out milking cows this morning. So I would like to welcome and thank Rhonda for being a part of this. And Rhonda, please take the controls and go from here.
Okay, Warren, I see. It looks like I've got the controls. So hopefully I won't. There. So as part of this webinar, I was asked to speak kind of to the animal side. And the way I approach this is kind of the things that everyone needs to know, both as educators, and probably as educators you're going to know a lot more than what I'm going to talk about. But these are things that when we work with our diverse clientele that we might have approach us, then we need to make sure that they understand some of these concepts and that they are comfortable with them. And while we are going to probably talk mostly about cattle today, I'd say all of us are probably cattle people, although I understand Kent's into pigs too. We have to think about the fact that there are several different classes of herbivores that we might be working with our clientele. And so I'm going to start off with a few definitions and some things about diet preferences for some of the different animal groups. So the first point is really to think about the fact that grazing animals did co-evolve with their natural diets, and their digestive systems reflect that. They were developed over time to optimize the food resources that were available to each of the species. So in the broad sense, I'm going to talk about things kind of from the standpoint of this is information that your clients will understand. Maybe it's not quite as academically oriented, but it's going to be stuff that a lay person needs to know and is going to understand if they're going to, attempt to manage grazing. So the first definition we might talk about is just the word herbivore, and that's really just a plant-based diet. And then within that we have ruminants, which is a particular type of herbivore that has a 4-compartment stomach that's designed as, the way I look at it is for batch processing of forages. And when we think about that with domestic livestock, we're talking mainly cattle, sheep, and goats. But we also have some herbivores that are not ruminants, and that would be examples of that would be swine and horses, which each actually are a little bit different also. Swine maybe move more towards the omnivore category. Horses are definitely herbivores, but they are not ruminants. So as we look at these different types of animal classes, then we also have within herbivores in the broad category, we have different diet preferences that have also evolved. And this is kind of just some definitions that relate to that. And at the bottom, you can see some examples of what the percent of the diet preferences might be for 4 different animal species. So if they like primarily grasses, and that would include maybe some forbs and herbaceous materials, even a few weeds, that would be what we call the grazers. And cattle are an excellent example, horses even more so. If we're looking at browsers, they like primarily woody plant foliage, they like shrub and forb stems and leaves, and they really do not prefer grasses. And so those would be an example there would be, of course, goats. And then we have other classes of animals that are kind of intermediates, and I kind of think of them as switch hitters, and they can adjust to the available food supply, and sheep perhaps would be a really good example of that class. So because ruminants are so important to our livestock agricultural systems, I'm going to spend a little bit more time. Really, the ruminant digestive system is kind of the ultimate, it's kind of the Cadillac of digesting cellulose. And so this is kind of just a few slides on how this works. Basically, a ruminant is considered any hoofed animal that digests its food in 2 stages. First, it's going to ingest the forage, and it's going to go in. They were involved to consume that cellulose-based roughage and consume it rapidly, and then kind of finish the process of chewing later on. So what happens is they ingest the forage, it goes down, and then at some later point when they have time to maybe rest and relax a little, they regurgitate their cud, they chew the cud. This is kind of the second stage of that initial ingestion process, and then the cud actually goes back down into the rumen and gets broken down and moves on out as digested material. So when we think about the other part about ruminants is that it also includes a digestive system that's really a fermentation process. So once this ingestion and chewing process is done, that's kind of when the microbes take over. And those microbes are going to be helping convert that fiber to usable nutrients. So my slides are not moving.
Rhonda, give us 1 second. We are fixing that right now.
Okay. If you want to move them, you can move them too.
Why can't I get on here? Rhonda, can you move on to just the next topic? Everyone should have been emailed the slides, but I will get it here just as quick as possible so that we're not just listening to nothing.
Okay, that sounds good. So the microbes use the fermentation process, as I said, to break down those complex carbohydrates, and that includes cellulose, which goes to glucose, and then the glucose is converted to volatile fatty acids. So when we look at that, when we have a higher fiber in the diet, that also stimulates the saliva production, which helps with that ingestion process, and that also in turn increases the volatile fatty acid production. So when we think about VFAs are extremely important, volatile fatty acids. Ruminants get about 70% or more of their energy from VFAs, and so it's very important that this process occurs of the fermentation of the cellulose down to glucose and then conversion to VFAs. And virtually all of the volatile fatty acid absorption occurs in the rumen. So on the next slide, I've got a little bit of just some kind of information about ruminant physiology that's kind of important to know. And really the bottom line is that we have to keep those microbes in the rumen happy in order for the process to work. And so when microbe mama ain't happy, there ain't nobody happy in a ruminant system. So the ideal environment really is about 100 to 108 degrees Fahrenheit, and the pH is somewhere between 6 and 6.4. So it's kind of a narrow range if you think about it. And the diet must meet both the needs of the livestock and the rumen bugs for energy and protein. If either one of those are limiting, then we're going to limit the amount of fermentation that can happen and how efficient it is. Pastures are generally a good protein source for rumen microbes, except for maybe very late in the season or during a drought or something when plant protein levels might fall. But generally, protein is not our limiting factor. It's usually going to be energy, and I think we'll probably be talking about that all the way through. So when we think about microbes, they actually become the major protein source for ruminants once they are digested, and they're going to be absorbed in the abomasum and the small intestine, which are further down the line of this system.
But you can switch back.
So the other issue is that we don't want to overfeed energy like with a slug feeding of grain, for example, because that can cause a swift drop in rumen pH, and that's going to shift or upset really, the microbial population. If we shift the pH below 6.2, then we're going to start to have some real problems in the digestion process. It's going to start to be impacted. So what nutrients are needed by grazing animals? Well, obviously water is going to be one of them. If you think about the idea of cellulose as something that has to be digested in this system, water is something that's got to be available to both the animal and the microbes for both the ingestion and the fermentation process. So we always need to make sure we have plenty of water available. Also, of course, we have salt and minerals available. We're not really going to focus on that too much today, but it is important for people to know that these are things that need to be available. And then the crude protein, we're interested in the content and the digestibility, but it is generally adequate in pasture systems. So energy is the one that very often we focus on the most. And carbohydrates are going to be that primary energy source. And among that, we have non-structural carbohydrates, which are the soluble sugars and starches, and the readily digested energy sources. And then we have structural or fiber, which includes cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. When you're looking at a forage quality test of forages, and they have lignin or ADF, that's really the indigestible portion, and so that's kind of considered the part that not even our microbes are going to digest. So, if we
Rhonda,
look
this
at,
is Warren. Rhonda?
Okay.
Could I break in for just a second and ask a question? So I know a lot of our grazing educators are involved with folks who are basically non-grazers, land managers, landowners. What about the ruminant physiology do you think is important when doing presentations or doing education sessions to those who aren't really grazers and maybe don't intend to be grazers?
Well, I think the important point, and I would say if this isn't a topic you're comfortable with, then find a buddy who can help you talk about these things when you're visiting with people. Because if you're a plant person and you don't have any animal background, but you're going out to a farmer who's worked with animals for his entire life, he's likely to know all this stuff. And you may not, and so you're not going to really pull any wool over his eyes. He's going to say, no, you don't have it right. So you don't, if he already knows that, he or she already knows, a lot of the basic stuff about, how animal systems work and how the rumen functions and all that kind of thing, then you can move on to focus on the other things that you're working on in the pasture. But we do have lots of clientele who just don't even know that, cows have 4 stomachs. And so we do need to know a little bit about it. And at the end of my presentation, I've put together a few research sources that people can use as really good handouts and as kind of references for themselves to kind of bone up on what they need to know. I would say the most important thing is that animals always have to have water for ruminant systems. We have to make sure that we don't short them there. And probably the second thing is going to be that energy is going to be our limiting factor most of the time. So, I'd say those are 2 things that we have to really make sure with ruminants we think about. So I don't know if I have maybe I do, maybe I can go on again. I'm still not able to move these slides.
Rhonda, just click on the main screen and you should be able to.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So when we're talking about our production level and how animals prioritize energy and protein, this is kind of an example. And one of the things that's important is that if we have a lot of stressors, that is where energy and protein, the priority is going to go first. So we have to limit our losses to stressors such as weather or parasites or disease so that we can actually have, work through maintenance, reproduction, lactation, and growth And, you know, that is our production parameters. Okay. So the other thing that we have to kind of think about is that we have different classes of livestock, and they have different energy and dry matter needs. And so, you know, these are just some examples. So the point is that our needs depend on the class of livestock and our production goals. And from there, that helps us kind of form some of our pasture management goals. Yeah. So the other point that we might want to think about from animal systems is that each animal species is going to have a different type of production cycle, and they're going to have different nutrient demands during that production cycle, during, you know, an annual production cycle, for example, with a beef cow. So those nutrient demands can change dramatically, and from, you know, 1 month to the next. And really what we're trying to do on pasture systems is to, as much as we can, match that livestock nutrient demand with our pasture production and our pasture quality cycle. And that way we can really optimize our system. So the last point I really want to spend some time on is dry matter intake. And dry matter intake is what grazing animals eat, and it's a function of several things. The first one is the time spent grazing. Animals do have an agenda, and they do have a schedule, just like the rest of us. We would expect generally that most animals would graze somewhere between 4 and 10 hours. If we have limited forage, they're going to have to graze somewhat longer. But the important part about this is that, remember that the two-stage process, we have ingestion of forage, and then we have the regurgitation, the chewing of the cud. Well, that's what cows do when they're resting. If you look at most cows, they're usually busy when they're resting. They're busy ruminating, and they're chewing their cud, and this is when this process happens. And so we do need to make sure that we have enough forage there that they can take in what they need, and then that they have time to ruminate and rest. The other thing that we have to think about, it's a function of biting rate. This is really kind of more of a physiological thing, so it's going to be kind of set with whatever animal we're working with. For example, the range with cattle is thought to be about 30 to 80 bites per minute. So that's not one we can impact too much. But the third one is bite size, and that's how much an animal can consume in one bite. And this is one factor that we can work with in grazing management by offering that biggest bite possible, really. So our goal is going to be to maximize a bite size of high quality forage with as few bites per plant so that we can balance those plant animal needs. So when we think about dry matter intake factors, we have to think about different things. One of them is palatability, and that's really how acceptable the forage tastes to the grazing animal. Another one is the nutrient value, and that's how many nutrients are provided and then how digestible they are for the animal system. We have to think about availability, how much forage is offered. And our goal, again, is to always maximize pasture dry matter intake, and that optimizes animal performance. So an example of good dry matter intake of cattle, these are some different expected gains in pounds of what we would expect at different live weight percentages. And we do have, you know, we can find that for most animal classes. So the idea with dry matter intake is that more is better. So when we're managing pasture for high dry matter intake, we have to remember also that grazing animals, they're going to naturally select the highest quality diet possible from the pasture forage that's available to them. So then our challenges become, if we have too little forage available, then we're going to limit dry matter intake. If we have too mature of forage that's available, that's going to limit the nutritive value of the dry matter intake, and it's going to slow rate of passage. So we're going to let Alan take over here in a second, but these are just a few of the resources that I thought would be most useful to an educator who's working with livestock producers of all kinds. Give you a little bit of background on this and just generally good information. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Rhonda, for that informative presentation. I'd ask the audience if there are any questions that you guys might have now for Rhonda. I think I'm seeing one come up here. Oh, sorry, my mistake. Well, if not, that's fine. We can always come back. You can always ask a question later if there's something that comes to mind. And again, thank you very much, Rhonda, for the presentation. I believe I have control of the slides now. And I want to move on to our next presenter. So many of you in the upper Midwest are very familiar with Alan Williams. He's a sixth-generation family farmer whose ranch and farm is in the area of Starksville, Mississippi. I've had an opportunity to visit Alan down there, and it's just fascinating what he and his partners have done with that piece of ground over the last several years that they've owned it. Alan is extremely involved in the industry, and as he calls himself, a recovering academic, and has been recently really involved with the Team Soil Carbon. And if you've ever seen the film documentary by Peter Bick, Soil Carbon Cowboys, then you've seen Alan on his ranch. He's been a very regular contributor to Graze magazine, among others. And Alan gives a lot of his time, presently serving on the board of the Grass-Fed Exchange and the Sustainable Agriculture Network in Mississippi. And Alan is also a partner and a member of the core team of the Pasture project. So I will turn it over to Alan, and Alan will take on the next phase here. And again, as a reminder to the audience that please, you can ask questions at any point, of our presenters. They're happy to answer any questions. Don't need to save any questions toward the end. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Warren. Appreciate that very much. Okay, let's see if I can get these slides to advance. Okay, now this was not my slide. Okay, here we go. All right, we'll go back to this one anyway. There's a number of different tools that are used to monitor the grazing animal. And to be honest with you, the best tool that you have are your eyes. Okay, frequent daily observation of how your animals are behaving, how they're performing, what they look like, their body condition score, all of those types of things, the consistency of the manure, are all very, very important. Through the years, we have wandered away from the observational side of things, and I think that's to our detriment. Really the very best way to determine success in a grazing operation is close daily observation of your soils, your forages, and the animals themselves. Now, one of the things as a grazing educator that you need to ask the people that you are working with, obviously, is what are the goals for your farm or ranch? And today, over the last several years, we have concentrated pretty heavily on soil health. And a lot of people have this misconception that soil health and animal performance maybe do not go together. As a matter of fact, a lot of times they potentially view those as antagonistic. So I want to ask the question, if we're trying to build soil health on our farms and ranches, is that antagonistic to animal performance? Or can we achieve both at the same time? And I'm going to present some data this morning that I think shows that we absolutely can achieve both at the same time. The other thing that we have to ask is, what cycle do you want to be in? Do you want to be in a cycle where you are using and relying on a lot of inorganic fertilizer, lime, herbicide for weed control, and these types of things? Or do you want to be in a cycle that allows you to have a well-managed water, mineral, and energy cycle on your farm or ranch? And then we need to ask the question, can our livestock be used as an effective land improvement tool? So to begin with, I would like to answer that last question by saying, absolutely, we have found that our livestock can be very effectively used as a land management tool, while at the same time maintaining and even improving the performance of those livestock. The two absolutely do not have to be antagonistic to each other. One of the things that we use our animals as a land management tool to do is to build soil health and to rapidly build soil organic matter through our grazing practices and principles. And so there's several questions that we can ask. We can ask, how rapidly can we build soil organic matter? How much can we influence soil microbial population and soil organism populations through our grazing practices? And then what influence do these grazing practices have on forage productivity and quality, water infiltration and quality, and animal performance? Well, to begin to answer this question, I have included some data that we have put together from a number of different states and different regions of the country. Now, this is not a definitive list. We have many more than this that we could include, but I was trying to hit a number of different regions of the country so that we could see that we can do this, in spite of the region that you're in. But in Mississippi, we have found, in this instance, in 4 years, we were able to build soil organic matter through our livestock grazing practices and principles from 1% to 4.2%. In New York State, we went from 1.5 to 4.1% in 5 years. In Kansas, 1.6 to 3.9, and so on and so forth. You'll notice in North Dakota, in 12 years, this was achieved, or we went from 1.6% to over 11% in 12 years, which is, pretty staggering that within that period of time, we could go from under 2% soil organic matter to double-digit soil organic matter. The great thing that we are seeing here and that we are noticing is that within a 10-year period or so, we don't seem to hit a threshold or a limitation. We're continuing to build soil organic matter at the rate of 0.5% to 1% a year. Obviously, there will be an inherent threshold in there, but if we can build soil organic matter in a matter of a decade or a little over to double digits, then we have enormously improved the functionality and productivity of the soils that we're working with in any given area. This next slide gives us an example of how rapidly we can build something with the right type of grazing methodology and practice compared to what we would call more conventional grazing scenarios. So the AHSD stands for Adaptive High Stock Density Grazing. So we're taking a very flexible high stock density grazing scenario, and comparing soil carbon data collected through 6 horizons, starting in the first 6 inches of the soil down to 3 feet or 36 inches. So soil pits were dug and soil samples were collected on each of these 3 operations, and these happen to be located in Mississippi, but we're doing this with Team Soil Carbon throughout every region of the U.S. This data was collected last fall. The CG Good is a conventionally grazed, what we would consider to be good or well-managed conventional grazing operation, where cattle are rotated once every 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something like that. And then the conventional grazing, or CG Poor, is basically a continuous grazing operation where cattle are allowed to roam wherever they want to roam on that farm or ranch and graze very selectively. The adaptive high stock density grazing operation is a little bit of background. This particular farm has only been in grazing for the last 5 years. Prior to that, for many decades, it was either in CRP or it was in row crop production, and it was in very poor shape 5 years ago when it was put into adaptive grazing. But you can see that within just 5 years, the total soil carbon has increased rather dramatically in this particular piece of property compared to both the conventional grazing operations, and that soil carbon was maintained at a higher level all the way down to 3 feet. Whoops. Can we go back one slide, please? Let me see if there we go. Okay. Soil organic matter. Okay. We took a look at the same thing, and keep in mind that on this particular farm that was using the adaptive high stock density grazing 5 years ago, the soil organic matter was measuring less than 1.4%. Now it's measuring 4.26%, and you can see that soil organic matter has been built in all the way down to 3 feet, greater than the original starting point. And at the original starting point, it was measured at 6 to 8 inches. And again, this is compared to the conventional grazing good and conventional grazing continuous, which both of those operations have been in grazing for 40 years or more on a continuous basis. Now, in terms of building soil microbial population, what can we achieve there? Again, with adaptive grazing principles, we have found and again, this is just a smattering of data. We have a lot more data that we could present than this, but I just chose some of the particular farms here. But on farm 1, in 4 years, we went from 2,300 nanograms per gram of total living microbial biomass to over 8,700 nanograms per gram. On farm 2, we went from 980 to 7,300. On farm 3, from 1,900 to over 11,000. And on farm 4, from 2,100 to over 9,400 in just 4 to 6 years in all of these farms. Now, what we consider to be a good total living microbial biomass for proper microbial function and activity in the soil is 6,000 nanograms per gram or greater. And you can see that then in a very short period of time, we were able to eclipse that and go far above that. And we're continuing to add to this each and every year that we're using adaptive high stock density grazing on these operations. On the next slide.
Alan?
Yes.
Alan, this is Jane Jewett. I'm wondering if I can break in here for a second and ask if you could maybe spend a minute or two describing what adaptive high stock density grazing is and how someone who's an educator might present that to the clients they're working with.
Yes.
Whether it's landowners or livestock owners or grazers, how would you go about presenting this concept to different audiences and show them its importance?
Very simply, adaptive high stock density grazing is a form of what you would understand to be mob grazing, which means that, and Kent is going to present a lot more in his portion on high stock density grazing, what it means, and how we achieve certain levels of stock density. So he'll cover a lot of that, but basically, in short, without taking away a lot of Kent's portion here, you know, it is achieving higher than normal stock densities per acre. So instead of looking at stocking rate or carrying capacity, you know, the total number of animals that we would graze per total number of acres in a farm or ranch, we're looking at how many pounds of animals can we graze per acre. Okay. Now, to do this effectively, it involves frequency of rotation. The more frequently we rotate from paddock to paddock, the higher the stock densities that we can achieve. If you rotate only every 2 weeks, every week, or even every few days, it's very, very hard to achieve high stock densities. High stock densities that can rapidly build soil organic matter and soil microbial populations are going to be stock densities that are in excess of 200,000 pounds per acre. Now, it does not mean that we have to do that year-round, but it means that at least at certain periods of the year, we need to hit every acre, or at least a certain number of acreage each year on each farm or ranch, with the higher stock densities. The stock densities are key to achieving the types of numbers that we're hitting here in building organic matter, total soil carbon, and microbial activity, and all of those lead to much greater forage biomass productivity and greater forage nutrient density and quality. So it has a tremendous impact on that, and I'll let Kent further delineate on the stock density and high stock density grazing, and if we haven't fully answered that, then we'll address that after Kent's portion. Again, the key, though, is remember that adaptive part, which means you need to be very flexible. For instance, this winter and through up until about 2 weeks ago here where I live in Mississippi, we were extremely wet. And with our soil type here, I have heavy clay soils. If I would have used high stock densities during that time period, then I would have pugged up my ground pretty significantly. So I had to significantly lower my stock densities and spread the cattle out. That's part of the adaptive or flexibility deal that we need in our high stock density grazing. Now that we're drying up and we've got a lot of forage biomass production with the spring flush, now I am increasing my stock densities and I'm moving my cattle every day or even multiple times a day to fresh paddocks. So I'm concentrating those cattle down to where I have those stock densities in excess of 200,000 pounds per acre right now, so that I can have a favorable impact on my land and yet still achieve the animal performance that I'm looking for. So this slide that is showing right now, and this is data that was collected by the USDA NRCS out of North Dakota, shows what can happen if you build high microbial activity in your pastures. And these are side by side. Okay, so in these pastures where we have high microbial activity that was built using the adaptive high stock density grazing principles, we have been able to build up to dry matter productivity of over 8,500 pounds per acre. And in the low microbial activity fields, it's down to 2,500 pounds per acre. And you can also see that not only did we significantly increase, more than triple the dry matter production per acre, but we also significantly improved the crude protein and TDN in those pastures as well. Another thing that most grazers need to understand, and this is certainly something that you can help them with as grazing educators, is the stage of maturity at which they need to graze their pastures. Too often what we see around the country are producers that are grazing pastures that are too early in maturity. The protein to energy ratio is frankly out of whack. The protein content in those forages is too high in relation to energy content. You notice that in the manure pats. You know, they're very loose, very runny, and you notice it in lack of animal performance. So to have the best ratio between protein and energy, we need to be looking in most situations at grazing our pastures at around mid-stage maturity. Particularly if you're grass finishing animals, we have found this to be one of the key factors to being able to put adequate levels of gain on to stack in back fat and marbling, or that degree of finish, in our grass-fed animals. Now, another thing that we have to deal with, no matter where you're located in the U.S., is year-round forage availability. Yeah, and what are our options? So oftentimes we're taught to look at, forage sequence options using mixes in our pastures of cool and warm season perennials and then cool and warm season annuals. For a lot of grazers, they are in situations where they can potentially plant or overseed annuals, potentially both cool and warm season. In the upper Midwest, to help get through some key time periods, overseeding warm season annuals can be very helpful in certain areas. What we like to do is we like to, again, using adaptive high stock density grazing as a tool to help our clients to tap into the latent seed bank and to use that to build a very good mix of both cool and warm seasons, and then use our grazing methodologies or practices to encourage one or the other in our pastures as we go through that grazing season. So again, in terms of forage sequencing, our primary options are to either have separate pastures with warm and cool season perennials, or to utilize in the upper Midwest our typical cool season pastures that exist during the growing season with some warm season annuals interseeded in a number of those pastures, or to utilize latent seed bank to be able to produce a combination of both in the same pastures. And we've been able to effectively do this everywhere from Canada down into Florida and the desert Southwest.
Okay, Alan, I'm going to break in again for a second here and let you know you've got about 10 minutes left, and remind people that you can raise your hands on your attendee line if you want to ask a question, or use the question box. And there was also a question that came in. Can you provide a definition of mid and late stage maturity?
Yes, basically late stage maturity is when most of your plants, particularly your grasses, are in the reproductive stage. Okay, so they have active seed heads that are formed, and you're going to see a large number of seed heads out there. In the mid stage of maturity, what we're talking about is we're talking about plants that on the grasses are going to have a minimum of 4 fully formed blades, and you will have a certain percent, that are going to be moving into that reproductive stage. They are not in, all grasses are going to form, grains of some type. And so just like small grains in corn, you define the stage of maturity of that seed head. They can be of the milk stage, the dough stage, or the hard grain stage. Here, what we're talking about basically are grasses that are no further developed than that milk or early dough stage. They're no further developed than that stage.
Okay, and then another question came in about the sweet spot, and it says the sweet spot would vary according to the animal and stage of production, dairy cow versus beef cow versus finishing steer. Shouldn't the goal be to optimize the productivity of milk, calves, or gain per acre? And that's a question from Gene Schreifer.
That's exactly what we're doing. And what we have found is that, again, that is exactly correct in terms of you adjust your grazing according to what you have predominating in that pasture. Okay, so if you are grazing 5 to 7 weight stocker steers and heifers, then you're going to need a higher protein level than you would with finishing steers if you're grass finishing. So absolutely you need to take that into account, and the stage of maturity at which you graze is going to be critical at that point. The same way with dairy cows, grazing dairy cows, obviously you're going to need adequate protein, but you're also going to need a high level of energy. So you're going to have to time your grazing to be able to fit the class of animal that you're working with. The sweet spot that I put up there is predominantly for grass finishing of cattle. That is the point that we have found that you get the optimum degree of finishing because you have the proper ratio between energy and crude protein in those forages. Okay, so to move forward, again, we like to develop diversity and complexity in our pastures. We don't want to deal with monocultures. We have too many holes with those, and we have found that having an excellent mix in our pastures is what we're striving for, and you can see in the pictures that are presented here, we have a lot of mix of grasses, legumes, and forbs. So again, what we're striving for in all of our pastures, rather than having monocultures, we're looking for a combination of grasses, legumes, and forbs in those pastures. We can also include some brassicas in there as well. And we like to have a combination of both C3 and C4 grasses so that we can extend that grazing season, and a combination of legumes and forbs that predominate both in the cool season and the warm season. And again, we've been able to do this through both interseedings of perennials and annuals, or through tapping of the latent seed bank. Now, how can we measure forage quality? There's a number of different things that we can do. There's plant tissue analysis. We can measure variables such as crude protein, TDN, ADF and NDF, net energy in terms of net energy maintenance, gain, and lactation. We can look at relative forage quality. And if you're measuring forages, I recommend using RFQ over relative feed value, or RFV. It's going to give you a much more accurate measure of what that forage is going to be able to do in terms of meeting the nutritive demands of the animal. And you can also determine your carbohydrates in there, such as your water-soluble carbohydrates, your WCS and NCS, which are measures of your simple sugars, starches, and fructans in the forages. Now, these are things that the average producer is going to have to collect forage samples and send them off for analysis and get the analysis back. So you can't do these cost effectively and also from a labor standpoint very often. The one thing that you can do often every day, every week, is measure the bricks in your forages. And so the question you have to ask yourself is, in terms of looking at forage quality, what is the most efficient and effective methods that I can use as a producer? What are they going to cost, both in time and in dollars? What do I want to measure? What am I grazing? So if I'm taking clippings to do tissue analysis, you need to take those clippings relative to the way you graze. If you're grazing with very frequent daily rotations and you're only allowing those cattle to clip the tops of the blades of the grasses and the leaves of the legumes and forbs and things like that, then you don't want to do clippings down to 3 inches, because you're going to get a skewed plant tissue analysis based on what your cattle are actually consuming. So you have to take that into account when you do your clippings. You also have to take into account what can producers most understand and implement, and that to be effective in terms of a measure of forage quality, it needs to be low cost, easily measurable, observational, and frequently implementable. And so one of the tools that we use plant tissue analysis frequently, but the tool that we can use more frequently, and every producer can use on their own, is plant bricks. And this is simply a measure of dissolved plant solids that include the sugars, minerals, amino acids, proteins, lipids, and pectins. Bricks is measured using a refractometer, the optical type pictured at the bottom there. $100 to $120 to buy a good optical refractometer. That they're very sturdy and they can be used over and over for many years. Basically, research has found that high bricks forages do a very good job of improving animal gains and performance and milk production in dairy cattle. For our clients that have been able to effectively increase bricks in their forages, they instantly see this in their milk tank. If they go from a bricks of 3% to 8%, they see a significant bump in milk production, and that includes not only fluid milk production but also milk fats and milk protein. We also know from published research that high bricks forages are more drought resistant, freeze tolerant, and more resistant to plant disease and pest. And it's not moving. Try it again. There we go. Okay, so through collection of data from a number of years and running regression analysis, what we have found is this. If we can improve bricks in our pastures from 2 to 5%, which is what the majority of pastures in the U.S. are, to 15% or greater, we will see average daily gains go from less than a pound a day to about 1 pound a day to the high 2s to even the low 3s. And bottom line is this: for every 1% increase in bricks, we get an added average daily gain of 1/10 to 3/10 of a pound on a daily basis. So again, to sum up, what we're looking for is we're looking for diversity and complexity in our plants and our pastures, both above ground and below the ground, rather than monoculture systems. And now I'm going to turn it back to you, Warren, to introduce Kent.
I think Jane has that pleasure. So Jane, please.
Yep, sure. Okay, so Kent Solberg is our next speaker. Can we get the slide advanced one? Let's see, do I have that? Okay, if someone could advance to slide 1, because Kent's bio is up on the next slide. But anyway, Kent Solberg is a farmer in northwest central Minnesota, And he has done a conventional type of dairying in the past and is in the process on his farm of a major soil health improvement effort using grazing and cover crops with an eye toward eventually transitioning into a more grass-based dairy. He's also a cover crop champion with the National Wildlife Federation and a grazing educator with the Sustainable Farming Association of Minnesota, and has integrated those interests into work on use of annual cover crops in the forage chain. Kent is also a strong proponent of attending to the fundamental principles of grazing in educational work, and in fact, the idea for this webinar topic today was his. Many thanks to Kent, and welcome.
Well, thank you, Jane. And I'm going to see if I can make the slides move now. Jeff or Matt or Robert, you may have to advance them for me. Doesn't seem to want to respond. There we go. Well, thank you. And good morning, everyone. Alan and Rhonda have done an outstanding job of laying quite a bit of groundwork here. They're just a wealth of knowledge, and I'm just going to fill in a few little spaces here. Want to talk about improving pastures first. As grazing educators, I think, at least myself, one of the most common questions I get from producers right off the bat is, what can I plant? What can I plant? What can I put out there? And I think, as we've heard from Rhonda and Alan, the idea here is focusing on managing our livestock to accomplish what we want to do. Alan presented some excellent data on how we can do that. And in the simplest form, I think, as we're talking with producers, it's talking about first reducing occupancy duration and lengthening the rest period, or in other words, as Alan said, increasing the frequency of how fast we move those animals to increase that stocking density to get the impacts that we want out there and the response that we want out there. One of the things we're also doing by doing that is tapping into the power of the latent seed bank through that animal impact. That latent seed bank is absolutely amazing on what it can provide for increasing diversity to our pasture swards out there. And as Rhonda likes to say, plant, fence, post first. Excellent way to improve our management, increase our density, and move forward on our productivity and our pasture. And then once I think producers do that, we can start talking about things like fertilizing, interseeding, reseeding, and so on. And I think we've all seen situations where there is an opportunity to do that, but it's usually after we focus on our management first, or getting them to do that. So pasture goals, what are you trying to accomplish? I'm going to hit this real fast. Alan and Rhonda have both touched on this. And Alan talked about these possibly being landscape and our soil health being possibly antagonistic with animal performance. Again, I would agree that they don't need to be, but there may be, for a time, a need to emphasize one over the other. And I think for the long haul, if we can encourage our producers to think more about the landscape first than some of the assumptions about past assumptions about what it takes to get animal performance out there, we can move those pastures to being very productive and moving those animals to performance. Can everyone, I'm getting a experiencing difficulties sign here. Are we still okay, Jeff or Matt? We must be. I'm going to keep moving until someone tells me otherwise. So there are limits, as was spoken earlier, on stocking rates or carrying capacity. And this is usually based on soils and climate. Again, that's been pretty well covered, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. But the bottom line is we want to balance the needs of the animals with the capability of the land. That's what we're really striving for, I think, in our managed grazing. I think it's important we discuss different forage types with producers. so they can, and even non-producers who own land, so they can understand the importance of this diversity and complexity that Alan covered so well. And even if you can get outside and spend some time kicking around in a pasture and identifying some of these plants so they know what we're talking about. The major groups would include sod-forming grasses, the bunch grasses, legumes, and then the forbs and other broadleaves. And as Alan articulated so well, just to strive for that diverse pasture. That increases our ability not only to provide habitat for microbes, but our ability to capture light and to begin turning some of that carbon into soil organic matter. I also usually cover just some of the grass types, the joining grasses, and the importance of the fact that they have elevated growing points, and that can have an impact on the ability of that plant to recover if we're grazing that too tight. And then non-joining grasses with a growing point at the crown or down near ground level. And then just explaining to producers and non-grazing landowners who may want to use grazing as a conservation management tool on their property that all cool season grasses are starting from the crown in the spring. As far as other pasture, other information on pasture forage types, cool season grasses like temperatures from about 60 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit, and warm season grasses like things from about 80 to 85 to up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And just the understanding of this is oftentimes very beneficial to the grazer and non-grazer, or to the land manager for understanding what they're dealing with. So Alan talked about determining our density. Oops, I think I'm going to have to go to, I might have to jump between slides here. I apologize for that. We'll start with this since we're already here. But how large of a paddock size? What kind of density do we need? And as well as determining how much forage do we need for those animals in order to meet their requirements. I'm just going to take a very simple example here. We can go back and forth on the numbers as you want. I tried to keep this as simple as possible, but just helping producers and non-producers understand how we can calculate what the needs are. So let's assume here we have a small herd of grazing Jersey cows. And just to keep the math simple, I'm going to use 3% of body weight to determine what they need to at least meet their maintenance requirements for the day. And then determining how big that paddock needs to be in order to meet their requirements for the day is figured here. I'm going to jump ahead. We'll come back to this in a moment. Oh my goodness. Okay, that didn't, I apologize here. We got out of sequence here somehow. But let's look at determining available forage that's out there. Let's just say for this example, we have a 16-inch average forage height. There we go. And for the purposes of our discussion today, we want to harvest about 50% of that. So we have 8 inches available. There's various methods of determining how many pounds per acre inch of dry matter out there. I'm sure many of you use these and know these. A common one that's often used and suggested is the 150 pounds per acre inch of dry matter. And under this example, we'd have 1,200 pounds of acre inch. I'm going to back up here to our other slide. I apologize again for the confusion. That's where we got the 1,200 for this example here. So, so for this herd of animals, we're going to need somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1¼ acres per acre inch. Or per acre, excuse me, per day. And as Alan said, we really want to observe these animals and how they're responding to that. Are we getting gain? Are we getting milk production? Are we getting rumen fill? Are they laying down and chewing the cud? Or are they up wandering around? What are those animals doing can tell us a lot, and we can adjust as necessary. Now, if we want to increase our density, or our pounds of animal per given unit of pasture at one time, or a concentration of animals, we know roughly how much dry matter intake those animals need for the day, and then we can subdivide that area down to get our density or pounds of animal per acre up, depending on our goals for that particular area. We've already talked about stocking rate. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that in the interest of time, so we can get to questions and discussion. And that's basically already been covered. Yes.
This is Warren. I think this presentation or this part of it is very important, and I wonder if you could maybe relate this to some experience with again, kind of either non-producing landowners or public or private land managers, and how these equations, so to speak, kind of can help them and help them to understand how grazing can have an impact on the land.
Yeah, again, we have to balance the needs of the animal with the capability of the land, and so these equations can help us. It can help give us some data, some numbers that we can help start with that balance, and then we can use that to start moving towards our particular goals. And whether we're working with a grazer or a landowner, I think a lot of people always scratch their head when they're looking at a piece of land. How many animals can I put out there? How can I achieve, the goals that I want? How can I get that adaptive or the densities I need to advance things like soil micropopulations and increasing soil organic matter? And these numbers can give us a means to a starting point to adjust our stocking densities, to adjust our paddock size, to help us determine the frequency of moves in order to move towards those goals.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I apologize. We've been through this already. We got a little out of order here. And Alan, just as a last slide here, Alan already had something like this already, but I think helping both producers and non-producers alike who are interested in using grazing as a management tool, understanding what some of this diversity can give us out there and how that relates to meeting animals' needs. So I'm going to stop there so we have time for questions and other comments. Again, one of the things we were looking for is interaction with the audience, because many of you are grazing educators yourself. We'd like you to share your tips, your hints, your suggestions, your ideas, so that we can all learn and become better at communicating to our clientele.
Thank you, Kent, for the presentation and also the nice setup. So we're to that point. We've got about 10 minutes left, I think, where we certainly have time for questions from the audience. And again, you have both the ability to kind of use that panel to ask a question, raise your hand, or to type anything in the chat box if you've got anything.
Okay, we had a question come in. It says a study, possibly Yale, indicated that a significant level of the population does not change their opinions or attitudes when presented with more science and more facts. How do educators reach producers that do not engage with facts and science?
I think that's an excellent question. And I think certainly all of our panelists have probably had that experience. So maybe we'll go around the horn and we'll work backwards since Kent just finished. So we'll go Kent, Alan, Jane, and give us 30 seconds to a minute your ideas about how you engage with producers who maybe aren't impressed by science. Kent?
Yeah, I like to bring in actual examples, and I'll often use examples from my farm or somebody else's farm of just general observations I've seen, and forage production, increases in forage production, increases in animal health, in animal performance. Yes, there's still some data there, but just to make it more personal, just to make it that I'm or the person I'm using as an example or to help support the talk talks about their experience, so it becomes more personal and not just cold hard facts.
Thank you. Alan?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with Kent. You know, and I found that to be very effective both in one-on-one interaction and in workshops, presentations, is to use a lot of personal examples, real-life examples. Producers do relate to that because the best way that producers learn and respond is peer-to-peer, you know. And so if you're doing something yourself that's working, they like to hear about it, and that has impact on them. But to take it one step further, the thing that has the greatest impact on producers is profitability, bottom line. And if you start talking to them about the opportunity to be able to reduce input costs, to be able to increase the productivity so that they can produce, you know, more pounds per acre, those types of things, then that starts getting their attention. When it hits their pocketbook, it gets their attention. So to bring in profitability is one very good way to quickly help them perk up and to listen to you.
Thank you, Alan. I've seen you use that profitability, and one of the things we will do in our webinar series is actually, I think our last webinar in October is the use of some of these tools around profitability, and next month we're actually, the webinar session will be on the financials around grass-based farming. So we'll get another bite of that apple, so to speak. Rhonda, how about you?
Well, I have to agree that the peer process is always very effective, and I think here in Wisconsin we've done a lot with our pasture walks, where people can, you know, they can come and, you know, be on farm, kind of see what the other guy's doing, and, you know, maybe speak with them at their leisure, and you know, either before, during, or after the pasture walk. I think that, you know, having that opportunity to, you know, get out in the field with each other and kick the dirt, look at the cows, and talk farming, you know, there's a lot of value in that. And I think that lots of times that's probably as much or more effective than any data we could throw at anybody.
Well said. Thank you very much. Jane, unfortunately, I don't seem to be, my question box is not updated. Is there anything else you're seeing?
Sorry, I was muted there. I don't see any other questions. No.
Okay. Well, for our audience, this is kind of the...
there came one. Hang on. One came in.
Go ahead.
Okay. Grass-fed is fine, but wouldn't even modifying the traditional beef finishing system be an improvement? For example, grazing until cattle are 800 to 900 pounds before going into the feedlot sector rather than at weaning at 500 pounds.
Yeah, Alan, this sounds like a question for you. I know you've got a lot of experience here. Please.
Yeah, this is Alan, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. You know, there are many producers that don't want to take it that next step in grass finish, and nothing wrong with that at all. You don't have to be a grass finisher, but the questioner is exactly right. To be able to carry those calves out beyond just weaning and to graze them into the yearling stage often adds value, particularly in today's cattle market, and that can be very significant value in terms of their bottom line. So being able to enhance your forage biomass production and grazing capabilities to be able to graze through the yearling stage is of absolute benefit.
Thank you, Alan. Kent or Rhonda, you guys have any thoughts on that particular topic or question?
Yeah, this is Kent. I wholly agree with Alan. I think you know, there's a huge opportunity there, and not just with beef animals, even with grazing replacement dairy heifers. I think we've seen data of savings upward of somewhere around 50 cents per head per day on doing that. So any options, any opportunities that are out there to use managed pastures as a way to increase farm profitability, I think are worth exploring.
And Warren, I'll add one more thing to that. With the significantly increased demand right now for grass for feeder cattle that are eligible for grass finishing programs, they love to buy those feeder cattle at that yearling stage where they're weighing 700, 800 pounds or more. So the market for that type of animal has increased dramatically and is going to continue to increase with the rapid expansion of the grass-fed market. So again, you know, all you're doing is enhancing your ability to be able to sell into a better market.
Okay, thank you, Alan.
We have a comment that came in. A rough rule of thumb is 1 gallon of water per 100 pounds of body weight for a non-lactating animal in a thermoneutral environment. This is easy for producers to remember, not exact but close. And that came in from Mark Hilton.
Good point.
Thank you, Mark, for that comment. Yeah. And for our panelists, I would expect we've talked about kind of the non-grazing landowner or private land managers, public land managers, having those kinds of rules of thumb when you're explaining to them what type of infrastructure, you know, particularly to a watering system, that they would need to make available to graze animals would be important as well, I think. Okay, we've got 2 or 3 minutes. Any last questions for our panelists? Well, if not, I want to thank the audience for being here and being attentive and all your questions. I certainly want to thank our panelists for being on today. Rhonda, Kent, and Alan, Jane, thank you very much for your help in moderating and putting this whole series together. I think the previous slide had a copy of the flyer on it. Just as a reminder, we do have a webinar series. While the dates aren't set certain, we expect that our next date will be June 5th to cover grass-based farm financials. We're still putting together the panel. I can only assure you that it's going to be as good and competent and expert as the folks who were on the phone today. And if you're interested in the types of things as grazing educators, the types of tools that are available, we'll try and focus that on both dairy and beef cattle, that particular session, but certainly you've got an opportunity to join that session. Also a reminder that there is a survey at the end. When you exit, you'll see the survey, and if you would take the time to fill it out, it'll be very helpful for us to try and tailor and make the best use of your time on future webinars. Jane, is there anything else that we need to let our audience or panelists know about?
The link to today's presentation slides is up on the Perennial Forage Working Group website, and I think rather than try to say what that link is over the phone, we will just email it out to everybody. But yeah, if you did not get a copy of the slides, they will be up online as well as some additional resources.
Okay, thank you for that, Jane, and once again, thanks to everyone for their participation, and especially to the folks at Wallace, Jeff and Matt and Robert, for all your help and behind-the-scenes work. And everybody have a good weekend and happy grazing.
Thanks.